Dan, first of all, are there, at this point in time in the campaigns, are there some national implications, in your opinion, from the poll?
No question about it. I mean, California is a deep blue, heavily Democratic state, so it is very difficult to see the state being competitive in a general election. That said, if you look at these poll numbers, they're lessons for candidates in both parties that are important way outside of California's borders. The most important question for Donald Trump is how he expands his base of support. Even though he's obviously a very strong frontrunner both in California and nationally, he hasn't demonstrated an ability to break through a ceiling of about 35 to 40% of the primary electorate. Our poll shows that roughly a quarter of Republican primary voters are resisting voting for him in the fall. A quarter are refusing to, absolutely. And so if Trump does become the Republican nominee, he has to figure out a way to stem the flow of potentially massive Republican defections, particularly among Republican women, to crossing over and voting for the Democrats.
And on the Democratic side, it looks like the race has gotten considerably closer than the last poll that you all put out.
Yeah, our survey shows that Clinton's lead over Sanders is now exactly half what it was in the fall. The other challenge for Clinton going forward is that while most of Sanders' supporters do believe she will be the next president of the United States, more than 40% of Sanders' supporters are not enthusiastic about voting for her in the fall. Hillary Clinton doesn't have to persuade Sanders voters to stick with her in November, but she needs to find a way to motivate them to turn out. Not so much here in California, but nationally, if she wants to recreate the Obama coalition that reelected the president twice.
So it sounds like the message to both leading candidates, at least in California and probably in other parts of the nation as well, is they've still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, both Clinton and Trump have very significant challenges with enthusiasm from the base of their respective parties. Trump's challenge is much greater because the Republicans who are not voting for him in the primary, in very sizable numbers, say they won't come back to him in the general election at all. Hillary Clinton, for the most part, does bring Sanders supporters back in the into the fold, but not with nearly enough motivation for her to win by the kind of margins that she needs to here.
What does she do to develop that, do you think?
Well, there are two ways to motivate voters who aren't that excited about you. One is to tell them something very powerful and very positive and very aspirational that inspires their support. The other is to scare the living daylights out of them by telling them what's on the other side of the aisle. If you've watched the election night coverage up until now, and I know you have, it's pretty clear which of those tactics is working better for Clinton.
Any surprises here that caught your attention?
I think the most surprising and the most important numbers are the large number of Republicans who simply will not vote for Trump in a general election. California will not necessarily determine the Republican nominee this year, but it is the last, let me try that again, I'm sorry. Okay. Look, California's presidential primary is going to matter for the first time in modern history. And on the Republican side, while California will not determine the Republican nominee, this is the last stop before the convention. So unless Trump wins California by a much larger margin than he appears to in our poll, he will go to the convention in Cleveland this summer without enough delegates to become the Republican nominee for president. And if you are a Republican who has some concerns about Trump, the fact that a full quarter of Republican primary voters in California will not vote for him in a general election has to give you additional motivation to find an alternative to him in Cleveland or beyond.
So does the fact that Trump then really needs California, maybe more than California needs him right now, and Hillary has now got a fairly small margin, certainly within the distance that Sanders could make up in a couple of months. Does that tell you that the primary here will not only matter, it'll be pretty damn important, and it could be all hands on deck, right?
Yeah, the Democratic nomination will almost certainly be decided by the time the campaign comes to California. But that said, we're the last stop before the convention. And Sanders is within pretty close distance of Clinton here. And if he were to win the primary, which is not a large stretch of the imagination, that sends her into the convention as the nominee, but is a very seriously hobbled one.
Yeah. And for Trump, on the other hand, I mean, it looks like he's going to have his hands full here as well, and that this will be certainly. I mean, one would have to imagine his goal is to nail down enough delegates to win, which you're saying he's not going to be able to do without winning California.
Yeah.
So.
Unless Trump goes on an incredible winning streak between now and the California primary, these poll results suggest that he's going to have a very difficult time winning California by a sufficient margin to get the number of delegates he needs to claim the nomination before the convention. He's running 7 points ahead of Ted Cruz in our polls. Among the most likely Republican primary voters, he's only 1 point ahead. And unlike in many other states where independents can vote in a Republican primary, that's not allowed here. So that base of support that he normally draws from independents isn't available to him. Unless something unexpected happens between now and June, when Californians vote, look for a very heated and a very contested and a very bitter Republican Party convention this summer. I think one other thing on the Clinton side. Clinton's greatest source of support throughout the first few months of primaries has been among minority voters, among African Americans and Latino voters. She's winning these communities in California, but not nearly by the margin she has in other parts of the country. If she wants to not only win the nomination, but to go into the convention with a strong base of momentum, she's going to have to figure out a way to convince African American and Latino voters, especially younger minority voters, to support her in much larger numbers than they are at this point.
And that's a problem she's had in some other states, where, not in the South necessarily.
It's been a larger challenge here than in other states. While Clinton is still winning the vote in these communities, it's not by the type of margin she'd need to in order to win the primary, by the margin she'd like to.
And is there a message in the poll for the other candidates, for Cruz, Kasich, and Bernie Sanders?
Well, yeah, John Kasich simply isn't very well known in California yet. And so it's awfully hard to predict from this survey a couple months out what kind of role he may be able to play in the California primary. But what's interesting on the Republican side is Cruz's support comes from those geographic areas where Republicans have always run strongest in California. Cruz does well in the Central Valley. He does well in the Southern California areas outside of Los Angeles. Trump's base of support, on the other hand, is in areas where Republicans haven't always done so well. He's doing very well in the larger urban areas, and he's drawing a non-traditional type of Republican voter who, at least historically speaking, is less likely to turn out for the primary. But because of the very unique way that Republicans award their delegates in California on a district-by-district basis, I caution you against drawing too many conclusions from the Republican side of this poll, except that it's pretty clear that while Trump is ahead, it's not by the kind of decisive margin he needs in order to secure the nomination in advance. Well, it's worth remembering that Republican Party registration is now down to 27% in California. When a Republican state runs statewide, he or she tends to draw about 40% of the vote from a lot of Republican-leaning independents. But Republicans have set up their primary rules so those independents can't vote in a Republican primary anymore. Those Republicans who are left tend to be very conservative. Those who've now registered as independent, they can't vote for John Kasich or Donald Trump.
That's very interesting. So that reminded me of what my other question was, which is about the Latino vote, and whether Trump may now be facing something similar to what happened after Prop 187 and Governor Wilson here in California, which is that Latino voters were so alienated that for decades since then they've gone Democratic in big numbers.
Well, Donald Trump's unfavorable ratings among Latino and Latina voters are over 80%. That's higher than we've ever seen for any individual ever, and certainly much higher than the levels of response we saw even in the 1990s in the immediate aftermath of Proposition 187.
That's pretty incredible.
So, Hillary Clinton's challenge, not here in California but nationally, is how to motivate Bernie Sanders voters. Well, if she can't do it, maybe Donald Trump can help her.